Okay, in this video, we're going to have a look at the concept of calculated fields. So to do that, we basically going to start by creating a new pivot table. One of the things I want to point out is when we create a pivot table, we usually go insert pivot table, but it's also possible to use this recommended pivot table. So just to briefly show you how that works, if I click on insert recommended pivot tables, Excel will come up with, looking at the data, it'll look at the data that you're currently on, and it will basically come up with various ideas for tables. So if you're not quite sure what table you want, you could actually use this to get some ideas. But most of the time in practice, I usually just go with a blank one and build it up from scratch. And that's by selecting the Insert Pivot Table option. Remember, it'll select the data range, which it already has, and we want to put it into a new worksheet, so I'm going to say OK. So for this particular one, what we're going to do is we're going to put in the product category, and I'm going to click on it. We want it in the rows. And I want to do the sales, the cost of sales, the gross profit, as well as the gross profit percentage. So I basically want to see all of that information by product category. Now, what you will notice, I'm just going to start off by just formatting these three. And remember, this particular one is a percentage. Now, clearly something is very wrong here with the gross profit percentage, because if I look at, take this amount here, 457,810 divided by that sales amount, you can't really be having a gross profit percentage of such a high amount. So if I wanted to calculate it, one other thing I want to show you, let's just do it outside of the pivot table. It's not normally recommended to do it this way, but what you would typically do is you could say equals to that, divided by this. Now you'll see that when I put in these formulas over here, right, it's actually using this, it's created a thing called get pivot data, which is basically telling, instead of putting an actual cell reference like E4 or D4, divided by B4, what it's doing is when I clicked on the particular cell, it generated this get pivot data formula function, which basically is used to pull information out of a pivot table. So what this particular one is actually saying is get the sum of the gross profit. Remember, we wanted this one here, and then it's saying A3, which is basically looking at that row labels, and it's saying product category is baking. So it's effectively saying go to the product category of baking and then pull up the sum of the gross profit column for that. And this is saying do the same thing, product category baking, but pull up the sum of the sale amount. The A3 is just basically where the actual pivot table starts. Right, so you don't really have to understand that, but what I wanted to show you is that if I copy this down, it's not going to make a difference because it's actually still going to do the same formula everywhere. It's still, even though I'm here at the bottom, it's still pulling those two values because it's actually pulling the details for baking and as well for baking, right? So to actually get around that, I have to manually type in equals to the, and I'll use the D4, right, which is that one. You can see I typed in D4 divided by B4, right? So if I manually type it in, okay, now I got a percentage over there, and if I double click that, now it'll calculate, you can see, and I can put a percentage. So if I look at it, these are the percentages I'm supposed to be getting. These are the accurate numbers based on that, based on this gross profit divided by that sales amount. But you can see this is actually providing the wrong information. Now, why is that? The reason for that is that if I double click on this here, right, and it opens up the detail, what Excel is doing is it's just summing up all the different gross profit percentages, which actually doesn't make sense in this case. So it's going here, and what it's done is it's basically, if I just go in here and put in a sum formula, it's effectively put in this number 40.37, which is the 40 point, well, rounding out to 43.8, so 4,038%. You can see 40.37. So what it did was it added up all the gross profit percentages, which is obviously incorrect, because the way it's supposed to work is that the gross profit percentage should only be calculated after these amounts have been totaled up. So I hope you can actually see the issue. The issue of trying to pull it in from here is that these gross profit percentages were calculated for each line item. But when we're in the pivot table, we can't really look at the line item detail. We first need to look at the total sum of all those lines in terms of what the sales was and what the gross profit was. And only once we have these totals can we actually calculate the gross profit. Now, it's not possible to basically do that by pulling in any field over here. We've got to do that gross profit calculation at the pivot table level, not by pulling it in from the actual data in the initial data table. And for that is what we're actually going to use we're going to use what we call a calculated field. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove this bottom one, the gross profit percentage. The other way I could have removed it is, you see when it was there, right, it was in there, I could have just ticked it off over here. So that's another way of removing it. So what we're going to do is we're now going to build in the calculation over here. Now remember, we could have just left this over here and just said this was the GP percentage, and we could, for example, just say, okay, we've got it, it's here, we don't actually need to do anything further. And I could just sort of paste it over there. And you know, why wouldn't we do that? Well, the reason for not doing that is, let's say now later on I go in and I add in a product, let's say I add in the product name, right, to this, right? And what I do is, if I then go and change this format, let's say we went into the design and we wanted it as a report layout where it was in a tabular form. Now, the moment I do that, it needs to expand the columns. And what's going to happen is it's going to overwrite all of this, right? As I'll show you now. So when I do that, you can see it's overwritten those values. I'm just going to undo. The other issue is, you'll notice that when we expanded the columns, right, and added in this additional detail, it didn't, the formula is only running up till here, so it didn't automatically calculate the gross profit percentages for all the rest. So that's why it's not recommended to try and do the calculation outside of the pivot table. It's best to do it inside of the pivot table, so that as you make changes to the pivot table, the calculation will also update. So to go and add a calculated field, what we're going to do is we go onto the Pivot Analyze tab, and you'll see this option Fields, Items, and Sets, and here we're going to select the calculated field. And now we give it a name. We'll call it gross profit, let's just say GP percentage for short. And in the formula area, we now can select other fields. So what we do is we actually now go in here at the bottom and we select the gross profit field. Click Insert Field, put a division sign, the / for the divide by the sales amount, and I can double click as well. I didn't have to click on the Insert field, so click on the Insert field or double click, and that's our formula. And if I click on Add, right, and I say OK, you see it's now added in this field called GP percentage. Now it doesn't show, you can see the values are there. So what we've got to do is we just got to highlight that whole column to do a quick thing, and now we format it, and you can see the formatting is correct. Now what happens is, say for example, I move out the product names, drop it back there, every time the formula updates automatically. So you can see now that it's working correctly. It's first doing the summing up, and at that level it now does the calculation of the gross profit percentage. So this is just one instance in which you would use a calculated field. There may be many other areas where you want to effectively create a new field based on a calculation that is dependent on other fields. Because as you can see, once we inserted that calculated field, it sits here as a new field in the fields area. But basically it's not a field that existed in the initial data. It's not this gross profit percentage, which is why I gave it a different name, but it is a field that exists from the calculation. So just to go show you again, if you go into the pivot table Analyze, and if you click here onto this Fields, Items, and Sets, you click on Calculated Field. Now if you wanted to edit it, what is important to note, or to delete it, you need to click on this drop down and select it. You'll see a list. Once you click on the drop down here, you'll see a list of all your calculated fields. Now if I click on it, let's say I wanted to delete it, I could basically click on delete, or I could make any changes and then modify it. So that's the way you would do that. Let's say I didn't want to show it as a percentage. I wanted to multiply this by 100. So let's say I say by 100, I'm doing a modification. I say modify and I say OK. You can see it's actually multiplied it by 100. So I could obviously remove it as a percentage and I just show it as a normal number. And so it's effectively the same thing, although I would recommend not doing it that way. And then finally, to delete it, the procedure, going back there into this Pivot Table Analyze tab, going back into the fields, into the calculated fields, you click on the drop down, you select it over there, and then you click on the delete option, and now it's deleted. And if I say OK, you can see it's been removed from the pivot table. So that basically concludes our lesson on calculated fields.